What are some awful things from the 70s, 80s, and 90s everyone seems to not talk about? Pollution. The smog was right crap everywhere in the summer. The cars smelled like raw fuel. The rivers were dirty, real freaking dirty, like peel the paint off your house dirty. Poison everywhere. Crap like DDT. They would spray it everywhere. I didn't see a large bird of prey until I was 20 years old. Now I see eagles and hawks every day. My parents like to go on and on about how violent things are nowadays, and how men would fight honorably and shake hands afterwards instead of shooting or stabbing each other. But the data shows violent crime peaked here in like 1978, the exact time period they remember for being so wholesome. So I don't know what the frick they're talking about. More people died in car accidents before improved safety features, airbags, and stricter traffic laws. From 1979 to 2005, the number of car accident deaths per capita decreased by 35%. The real, visceral fear of nuclear war. Before the Cold War ended, I had such bad anxiety about that as a teenager that it would cause me to throw up. In the 90s, there was a good chance that your stereo would literally destroy the cassette tapes you put in it. They were never cheap cassette tapes, either. They were the ones you just bought. Imagine if every time you played an MP3 from your phone there was a 1/15 chance the MP3 would disintegrate. Harvest gold and avocado green kitchens. On a lighter note, cartoons in the 80s were only made to sell action figures and were not that good in hindsight. Whenever we see a bald eagle, my dad will often tell me about how he very rarely saw them as a kid and teen because their population was so low. Now I see quite a few each summer, when he was lucky to see one a year. Secondhand smoke. I was a youngster in the 70s and 80s and people smoked all over the damn place. My brothers and I would be trapped in the car with my dad chain smoking on the 6-hour drive to my grandparents for Christmas every year. The only places you couldn't smoke were on the bus and at the movies. Where I live, smoking wasn't completely banned in restaurants and bars until the late 90s. There were a few years around then that I hardly ever ate out. I couldn't enjoy my food because of the smoke. AIDS. Oh my god, the noise. Every 16-year-old kid had a primer gray muscle car that could shake the china out of a cabinet. I swear that there is something about blasting music on 8 tracks and cassettes that made it carry farther and sound even worse. Even the tires on cars were noisy, and the barn door cross sections pushing wind could be heard from hundreds of yards away. The planes were louder, too. Buses and dump trucks were so loud conversations had to stop when they idled past at a stoplight. The televisions all sounded like crap, and so did the broadcasts. They all had a background studio hum that sounded like a partially unplugged bass guitar. Some wasted asshole in the neighborhood would always turn the TV all the way up and then pass out, and then the broadcast would end at 2 AM and static or a test tone would blast at top volume all night. In summertime in the city you could hear that crap on every block if you were dumb enough to be on the street at that time, because that was a great way to wind up on a milk carton, which was also a weird ass thing. Missing children on milk cartons. Yeah, they had earphones back then and they actually worked rather well. But it was way cooler to heft a 20-pound portable stereo on your shoulder and blast a 4-second loop of Kraftwerk with some angry dude shouting over it. And those guys had to shout because everything else was so obnoxiously loud. The safety of cars. Most of them were just tuna cans on wheels. Very pretty tuna cans, but still tuna cans. Tuna cans. The Bosnian Civil War/conflict in the Balkans. Even the Rwandan genocide doesn't get mentioned very often today, though people still remember it happened. A lot of people don't remember that NATO was bombing Kosovo when Harrison Klebold shot up Columbine. I spoke to my students today about how lucky they are to be able to stream music, as I downloaded 5 MB songs with a 56K modem on Napster. I also boasted that a 30-minute download for one song was considered an extremely fortunate run, and that there was a decent chance your download might not even be the song you wanted. I saw the moment in my students' eyes when I became their equivalent of Grandpa Simpson. I'm 34 years old. The troubles in Ireland are rarely talked about. Ireland was basically a war zone in some parts for quite a while. In the UK there seemed to be dog crap everywhere. The type that turned white and could cause blindness if kids picked it up. Early 90s racial tensions were wild. The Odd documentary did a great job of covering some of it. Calling the house phone and talking to her parents. The whole satanic panic. People had their lives ruined in these modern witch hunts. The thalidomide disaster is one of the darkest episodes in pharmaceutical research history. The drug was marketed as a mild sleeping pill safe even for pregnant women. However, it caused thousands of babies worldwide to be born with malformed limbs. AIDS in the 80s and early 90s. I was a little kid during the era, being born in 85, and some of my earliest memories are of people talking about it and how they didn't care what the TV said. Nobody I knew would have touched anything a person with AIDS had also touched. The paranoia was terrifying. I remember meeting one of my mother's friends who had the disease and he seemed normal. I hugged him and everybody made a big deal about how brave it was for me to do that. Such a dark time. The Challenger rocket disaster. I can't imagine how terrifying it was. The 1970s is a major transition decade in socio-political trends, but often gets overshadowed by cultural things like drugs and disco. For example, the 70s began the large decrease of union influence in party politics. This likely contributed to income inequality we see now. Trust in government plummeted in the 70s. Those trends are very clear. Lastly, the polarization of Congress started in the 70s. But we speak about it like it began in the 90s or even the aughts. 70s, the fact that racism was still very much a problem in, well, pretty much everywhere in the US. 80s, the ghettoization of urban America and a massive increase in housing and income gaps between the rich and, mostly racial minority, poor. 90s, AIDS. And the fact that everyone treated the people who had it like witches who should be avoided at all cost and emotionally shunned. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge killing fields in Cambodia. 30% of people were tortured to death and killed with medieval weapons. Absolutely horrific. How girls were viewed. 70s. When I was at school, girls were not allowed to wear trousers. We did cookery while boys did woodwork and tech drawing. Women were not allowed to fill in their own tax returns. Had to be their husband. Margaret Thatcher changed this. Even 10 years later in the 80s I was turned down at a job interview and the feedback was because I was wearing trousers. The US installing puppet regimes ran by brutal dictators in Central America, the effects of which are still being deeply felt today. This is truly small scale compared with some of the bigger suggestions here. But, fashion magazines for teenage girls. I spent a weekend reading a teen magazine from 1985 for a research project. Some of it was hilarious. Tutorial on turning your stirrup pants into leggings. Arguments over whether Madonna is better than some pop singer who has been completely forgotten by time. But a lot of it was really depressing. A feature explaining that regular people should avoid socializing with homosexuals because of AIDS. A letter to the advice column on the best way to exclude a friend who has just admitted to being a lesbian. Really terrible sex edition. And there were no people of color whatsoever in a whole year of issues. Every single face was white. The stuff being published for teenage girls now is a lot more sophisticated and less exclusionary. A lot of it's still ephemeral, that's the nature of fashion and pop culture, but the substantial stuff is better, and I hope it will still seem terribly dated in 40 years time. Polio. But we are actually starting to talk about it again. Thanks to pro-epidemic crowds. We take it for granted now, but phone service outside of the local area used to be a big deal cost-wise. Lead-in petrol. It's all gone now, and nobody talks about it. My local 711 still has pumps marked unleaded, but I mean all petrol is unleaded. How Reagan got off scot-free from Iran-Contra, and then Bush pardoned a crapload of people found guilty from that administration. Rampant and prolific cigarette smoking everywhere. People smoked literally everywhere you went. In cars with the windows up packed with children. People smoked in doctor offices and hospital waiting rooms. Every cafeteria and restaurant had a thick smoke haze. Airplanes were giant smoke-filled tubes. Some doctors would smoke right in their offices. Everyone had ashtrays in their homes, even if they did not smoke, because nobody really asked for permission. People just lit up wherever they were. I used to smoke while working as a cook in the kitchen, and so did everyone else. It started tapering off in the late 1980s, and by the mid 1990s most places disallowed smoking. I remember what it was like to realize that the acrid stench of cigarette smoke was no longer a part of everyday living, and that air had a rather nice and refreshing aroma. It made me really hate cigarettes. A big one for me is the availability of music. Back in my day, frick me, I'm actually using that phrase unironically for the first time. You had to go to the record store and actually know what was good before you bought it, or take a risk. It took like an hour and a half of your time to buy an album, and that's if you lived in an urban area. If you lived out in the cornfields you were basically fricked and had no access to popular music at all. Now, click your music app of choice and search. Takes 2 seconds, and there's no risk. If you don't like something, you just search again. It will even play similar music for you. It's kind of crazy to think about it. Stirrup pants. Cars broke down a lot. Have to take my car to the garage was an exceptionally common reason to miss work. Get in the car, turn the ignition, and nothing, or some horrific squealing. Or you'd be driving along at 45 miles per hour and suddenly some steam / smoke / gas would start coming out from under the hood, or the car would randomly overheat. Meanwhile, these days we drive our cars into the ground, 200k plus miles, and having to take one into the garage for a repair is incredibly rare, and even when we do take a car in, it's usually because it's behaving abnormally, not because it's completely dead. In Poland, gangs were rampant as soon as communism had fallen. Every bigger city had a couple of gangs fighting for influence and profits, mainly from extortion, prostitution, break-ins and kidnapping. Now nobody seems to even remember this. Crack being introduced into urban areas to break up the family units. The rampant homophobia, it could kill your career. Ellen DeGeneres' experience after she came out is a good example. You could lose your family and friends, or worse, your life. It's hard to imagine now how widespread and socially acceptable it was to hate gay people. Everywhere you went you came home with clothes reeking of smoke. My grandfather's mustache was yellow from smoking. Also, women had to endure incredible sexism everywhere. Cults were a problem in the 70s. The colors. Who the hell thought that olive green, rust orange and mustard yellow was a good idea, let alone swirled together in paisley patterns? A travesty never spoken about. Chernobyl. Today we act like it didn't happen and make video games about ruined nuclear sites, but as a 9-year-old kid, going to school and being told you can't play outside for a week because there is nuclear fallout in the atmosphere. That crap is scary, especially since you have no idea what it is or how to hide or protect yourself from it. Someone said something about this before, but the food pyramid and the ridiculous amount of bread, grains, and carbs that the governor told us we were supposed to eat. Diabetes everywhere. American violent crime started rising in the 1970s and kept rising until it peaked in 1991. Then it started to decline. 2015 was the lowest violent crime has been since 1972. How bad the actual fashion was when it comes to comfort. The Falkland War. It may be just perception, but it seems like the 70s, 80s and 90s were the rise of serial killers. Skinheads. My parents talk about them a lot but seemingly not many people did. My dad used to run home from school because he wore a turban and my mom would have rallies on her road every weekend where she would look out the window and see her classmates, among them shouting and chanting. Whooping cough epidemics in the UK. Before a vaccine was introduced in the 1950s, the average number of suspected cases in England and Wales was over 100,000 each year, and in some years over 2,000 people died from pertussis. By 1972, when over 80% of children were vaccinated, this had fallen to 2069 suspected cases and 2 deaths. In 1975, unfounded concerns about the safety of the vaccine resulted in a fall in vaccination rates. Only 3 out of every 10 children were vaccinated against pertussis in 1975. This resulted in major epidemics in 1977, 79 and 1981, 83. Since 1992, The UK vaccination rate has remained at around 94%. And then in 2012 we had another. Thanks to morons not vaccinating. I've got a permanent whoop thanks to having it in 1982. And yes, I was vaccinated. I should never even have come into contact with it, but for that huge drop in immunization rates. Stray animals. Even up until the late 90s, I remember seeing stray dogs running around a city neighborhood and not thinking twice about it. Now I rarely see strays. Fire safety. Even for firemen. SCBA came out in the early 70s. 2 packs were kept on the back of each truck, but it could be 6 months before they would see use. The career firefighters would scoff at any rookie who used SCBA, so they weren't required by all departments until the mid-2000s. Even PPE regulations weren't nationalized until 2006. At that point, Chicago FD still used 3/4 boots, rubber jackets and rubber hats. From the 70s, plenty of domestic bombings, airplane crashes, the rise of Islamic terrorism, the projection of American weakness, and American governmental insanity. From the 80s, airplane hijackings, the celebrity benefit concert, the ugly realities of the AIDS crisis. From the 90s, the idiocy associated with the end of history, the rise of the 24-hour news cycle, the acceptance of gang culture, the giant sucking sound that turned out to be accurate, the cowardice and fecklessness of the GOP which was suspended for only 2 years. The motherfucking phone company. There was one phone company, AT&T, for the whole goddamned country. Calling the next city was long distance. Calling the next state or another country was also a really big deal. It was totally common to spend hours at home waiting for an important phone call, since there were no mobile phones at decent prices until the 1990s. Often, when you called, you'd get a busy signal, so if an important call might come, nobody was allowed to use the phone. When MCI broke into the long distance market, it started the revolution that led to the relative nirvana we live in today. As far as phones are concerned, the phone companies are doing their best to turn it back into a monopoly. We must never go back. I lived in Japan, still do, and Japan was even worse. You actually had to purchase the right to a telephone, like a deed, which was like $700. You couldn't sell it back to the phone company, but you could sell it to someone else, so they could get a phone. What a scam. Rwanda genocide. 300,000 slain dead. What was on the news? O.J. Simpson's trial. Boredom. I remember being bored a lot. Now with computer games and Netflix you at least have a fallback as opposed to just sitting around starting at the wall. At best, gay people were expected to keep their lifestyle quiet and under the radar. They were often seen as the weird members of the family and second-class citizens. If accused of flirting with a straight person, they could be killed. Worse, the killer could potentially go free because their reaction was seen as understandable. This still happens today, but thankfully it's not as common in most places. In Spain, although Franco, the last dictatorship that Spain had to suffer, is still being talked about, some people seem to forget all the bad things he did. Spain was safer when Franco was alive is the most common sentence to hear from someone that was alive by that time. But homosexual people were being chased and killed by the regime. The person that was brave enough to protest against it wouldn't last long. All the press was under full control, and when something that the regime didn't like was published, it was instantly banned and prevented from being distributed. That's just to name a few things. I wasn't born yet in that era. My parents were born 2-3 years before he died, so I can know as much as the history books and series, based on historical facts, do tell. People used to smoke on planes. Looking back just seems absolutely unreal it was a thing. Getting your car stereo stolen out of your car. Motor racing. My mom is a huge fan of F1 and other events, but at least once a year we watch the documentary on the Le Mans disaster. She showed me how the tracks are forced to change to catch up with newer models of racing cars, and how they are made to fall apart easily, so that when there's a collision the driver doesn't get smooshed. Crowd safety improved, laws were changed, and far less racers have died. Berlin Wall. The lack of safety in everything. There's a pic of me as a baby in a playpen right next to an outlet. I played football, and concussed players were brought back on the field. Even one teammate who did not know where he was. There used to be snow when I was young. So much snow, we had to shovel it higher than the height of our car. So much of it, you didn't know how you would be able to find a place for it. We could produce a mountain high enough so that we could crazy carpet our way down for a significant amount of time. I remember when I was a teen, and we had one of those driveway in a half circle shape. We didn't have a snowblower. I had to shovel it by hand. 2 hours with my stepdad. Sometimes 3 nights in a row. Because the snowstorm were happening so often. Now, I don't even have snow on Christmas. Wearing patchouli oil as a perfume cologne. 1960/70s. Oil slicks in almost every parking space. Cars used to drip oil from their oil pans. Americans seem to ignore the IRA, who are still highly active, mostly because a lot of their funding came from Irish Americans in America. The funding stopped after 9/11, when people realized terrorism was wrong. TV sucked in the 70s. Just compare an old Doctor Who with a new one, or Ozark with the Rockford Files, and I was a fan of the Rockford Files. Back then they just cranked out the shows and did not care about writing. However, there were a lot of good movies from the 70s. White dog crap. Ring pulls. People would open a can and discard the ring pull. There were billions of the things. From the 70s, key parties. As you arrive at a party, all the men put their car or house keys in a bowl. At the end of the party, each woman would pick out a set of keys from the bowl and go home with the guy whose keys she picked out. I'd never heard about this until I saw the excellent film The Ice Storm.